All right, so where we finished off there, on the bottom of 59. And so this idea of thinking about volition as it relates to, again, kind of two instances, two probably like really clear instances where alcohol use dramatically affects how one engages with one's surroundings, predominantly and kind of most notably studied are aggression and sex, right? That the idea that people are more aggressive when they've been drinking alcohol, or they behave differently, or they behave even more aggressively towards sex and sexual decisions, or they lower inhibitions as it relates to sexual decisions after consuming alcohol at various points. Like those two instances have been well documented in a lot of differing ways, right? But again, the argument here is, for our purposes, like, even though I am now inebriated, the thought that I still have a will, it's just a different kind of will than I had prior to drinking. Okay? And so they say here on the bottom of 59, there's little doubt that alcohol intoxication increases aggressive behavior, right? Specifically, it's not the case that alcohol is associated with increased aggression per se, but rather it's associated with increased aggression in response to provocation or threat. And this paragraph, again, kind of goes back to something in the very first video today of controlled and uncontrolled behavior, right? If I've had a couple of beers and I'm heightened, right? I'm in a different state, right? And if somebody comes up and is being really aggressive towards me, chances are I'm going to react a bit differently than I would had I been sober, right? And so the question is, like, I'm not now naturally more aggressive because I've been consuming alcohol, but my interpretation of my surroundings, and because I've consumed alcohol, in fact, I'm more prone, I'm at least kind of at greater, I'm prone to an increased aggression due to provocation or threat, right? Like that's the takeaway. It's not that I'm like all of a sudden just more aggressive because I've been consuming alcohol, but rather the way I'm engaging with the world around me and the way that I process threat, the way that I process provocation is different than I was when I was sober. Similarly, there's no doubt that alcohol is associated with increased sexual behavior. However, once again, this effect is subject to multiple qualifications. Specifically, alcohol tends to be associated with indiscriminate and risky sex, right? Intercourse with multiple partners over a short period of time, one-night stands, right? But for both sex and aggression, then, alcohol is perhaps best understood to interfere with the ability to control or override a situationally cued automatic response. Aggression in response to provocation, sexual intercourse with an attractive but socially risky other. Okay? And so what essentially they're trying to say here, what they're trying to get at is, again, this notion that I'm just not, like when I have a couple beers, I'm not naturally maybe more prone to risky sexual behavior, right? But because of my increased perception, my increased, my increased perception, my increased kind of stimulant, whatever that may be, maybe has me act differently. So my volition is just different now. That might lead to more. Risky behaviors. Okay. All right. Again, just conceptually, generally speaking. And then they go through perception, inference, effect, yada, yada, yada. And what I actually really like here is I'm now skipping here to 62, right? And they actually like bring up the brain, so conversations from past Tuesday, the way that the brain, or the way that alcohol affects the brain, okay? And then this also sets us up nicely on 63, where finally, with respect to responsibility for one's actions, typically assumes volition, right? It typically assumes will, right? That if I behave in a certain way while I'm drinking, I should be responsible for how I behaved while I was drunk or while I was consuming alcohol. Sometimes we try to escape that. Sometimes we try to say, oh no, I was drunk, I can't be held responsible. Or, oh no, I was drunk, I didn't mean what I said, right? But you said it, you did it, you should be responsible for what it was that you said, what it was that you did, right? You might have just been acting under a different kind of volition, like a different kind of volition, okay? Finally, with respect to responsibility for one's action, we typically assume volition. The present approach simply assumes an ability to regulate one's behavior, yada, yada, yada. Okay? And then lastly here, the conclusion is that we believe that present analysis we believe that the present analysis offers a different volition action that is capable of clearly resolving some confusing use of the terms will and volition. Are children being willful when they act impulsively to attain what they desire? No. Children may have desires that may act impulsively, but they only become willful when they recognize and reject a standard, right? As a guide for their behavior. Is the will involved when children restrain those impulses? Yes. And that is true whether they do so based on their own personal standards or societal standards, and whether they are aware or unaware of what they are doing or why. Okay? And so, can the functioning of the will be impaired by external agents such as alcohol? Yes. We have noted multiple mechanisms involved in this effect as the additional mechanisms, yada, yada, yada. As evidence that the impact of alcohol on the will has long been acknowledged by popular culture, right? Yada, yada, yada. That last paragraph is not all that helpful. But essentially, again, what we're getting here in this article, and I apologize if it seems a bit scattered, but the terminology is weird, it's choppy, right? But I think that there is an interesting way that allows us to conceptualize and move nicely into the discussion of, are we someone else when we consume alcohol? If so, to what extent are we responsible for the decisions that we make? Even though we do have volition, we do have will as it relates to the decisions that we're making, right? To some extent, right? I mean, if somebody is completely blacked out, then obviously that's a very different conversation. But hopefully this gives us a groundwork to at least stand on to move forward in the videos that are remaining that kind of deal more conceptually and more generally with this question of who are we when we consume alcohol. So thanks for bearing with me on these, and hopefully we have a new vocabulary or a new way to think about kind of how to understand our actions or maybe lack thereof as it relates to consuming or not consuming alcohol. Cheers.